Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we're talking about King Crimson coming back, sort of. As some music lovers will know, the last few years, well, before COVID, which sort of seems like yesterday, but before that whole thing, King Crimson, in a very large incarnation, was on the road, and they were on the road of many continents. It was a lineup that didn't really record anything original at first, although they later did, and the lineup generally evolved. But it was kind of what I call the King Crimson show band. It was a version of the band that tended to take from all of the different eras of the band and play the pieces authentically. And this was, of course, interspersed with a lot of the improvisation for which the mid 70s King Crimson was very well known. The one with Wetton, Bruford, Fripp, of course, David Cross, and for a while, an eccentric percussionist alongside Bruford called Jamie Muir. Then Robert Fripp thought the world was going to end, so he disbanded the group in 1974 and retreated to a kind of ashram type of getaway, a place called Sherborne House in the West Country of England, where he studied under a man called J.G. Bennett, a philosopher who practiced a lot of syncretic ideas that mixed Oriental and Occidental philosophies. The breakup of the band was a bit disappointing to those focused more on music than of a kind of spiritual awakening. John Wetton and Bill Bruford were disappointed, but a few years later they were back together in the band UK alongside Eddie Jobson and Alan Holdsworth. When 1981 came and the world didn't come to an end, unless, of course, you're Jimmy Carter, Robert Fripp decided to get the band back together. So he called up Bruford and said, "Why don't you come back and we'll form a band, call it Discipline." And then he recruited Tony Levin, who has played with everyone, but most recently at that time, and he still plays with them a lot, Peter Gabriel, and of course, Adrian Belew, who had played with Frank Zappa and had toured with David Bowie and had done a bit of work with the Talking Heads. And this was a brand new band that didn't really have any direct connections to the style of music of the 70s Crimson, and the only connections in terms of personnel were Fripp and Bruford. The music was very interesting. The rhythmic patterns that were used borrowed a lot from the Indonesian classical percussion movement known as the gamelan. And if you listen to some gamelan music on YouTube or elsewhere, and then listen to some of these albums from the 1980s iteration of King Crimson, you'll notice some very interesting similarities. So I encourage you to do so. But Fripp, with his propensity to change lineups and break up his own band, ended this lineup after only three albums: Discipline, Beat, and Three of a Perfect Pair. Much of this lineup got back together in a expanded version in the 1990s, which was more of a sort of industrial sounding, almost metallic sounding Crimson. Bruford was back, Belew was back, Levin was back, of course, Fripp can't help but be back. But they were also joined by Pat Mostellato, who was in the great and much underrated 80s band Mr. Mister. They were more than an 80s rock pop band. They were actually really, really good musically, and they grooved and they were fun, super talented musicians. Check out Mr. Mister. You won't be disappointed. And then Trey Gunn, who played something called a war guitar, a kind of stick meets stick meets stick, if you will. Stick referring to the Chapman stick, an upright instrument strung over the shoulder that Tony Levin popularized, which functions as kind of both a bass and a guitar that you can play with both hands simultaneously. The whole thing one giant fretboard, if you will, in the shape of a stick, no less. So the King Crimson that are getting back together this year are not going to be called King Crimson, but it's King Crimson in all but name. You've got Adrian Belew from the classic 80s lineup, Tony Levin's back from that classic 80s lineup. Bill Bruford retired almost 20 years ago now. So he's still very active in terms of talking about music, and he posts on YouTube with extensive commentary in his description sections, but you couldn't get him back on the road for love or money. Robert Fripp does what Robert Fripp wants, so he will not be there, but he's given it his blessing. Bill Bruford has given it his blessing, and the drum chair will be filled by Danny Carey, best known for his work with the sort of neo-progressive band that came out in the 90s, Tool. And on guitar, of course, a legend in his own right, the great Steve Vai, which gives two Frank Zappa connections to this particular tour, both Adrian Belew, who played in Zappa, and then a few years after, Steve Vai, a very young Steve Vai, joined Zappa, Stevie Spanking, a song Zappa wrote about him. You can guess what it's about. We were talking about Zappa lyrics just the other day. So all of this leads me to think some of the great bands of the rock world from the 60s through the 80s, they're getting old. Many are getting retired. Some, unfortunately, are dying. And so, what's going to happen to this music? Well, let's look at some older genres and see if we can venture a guess. Let's start with classical music. Most of the great classical musicians of the Romantic and classical ages died before the advent of recording. Some of them lived into the 20th century, just barely, but most of that, your Beethovens, your Wagners, people like that, Tchaikovsky, they died before sound was really getting going. In Beethoven's case, long before. So the only way to enjoy that music outside of the lifetimes of the composers was to play it with other people involved, maestros who were not the composer, musicians who, after a generation, didn't play with the composer. Then came jazz. And today, obviously, most of the people from what a lot like to call the golden age of jazz are gone. Coltrane, long gone. Charlie Parker, long gone. Miles, long gone. Art Blakey, long gone. The list goes on. But the tunes written by and popularized by these soloists or accompanists, or the ensembles in which they played, these are played by jazz combos across the world on a nightly basis, so their composition lives on. So, what's going to happen to rock, a more commercially viable format than either jazz nor classical? Well, right now we're living in this interim period where there's still a lot of these musicians from the golden age, this classic age of rock, that are playing live and selling shows, sometimes in big arenas. And then there's the question of what to do when someone isn't around. A lot of this becomes complicated by questions of copyright, ownership of trademarks, and all of the rest of the legal tie-ups that stem from that. We talked just the other day on this channel about the great Eddie Van Halen and the fact that it's been really, really hard to put together a tribute show for Eddie for a lot of interpersonal reasons and maybe some legal ones. What then happens in another 20 years or more when all of these great rock stars are sadly no more? Will the music simply die, or will it live on in the way that people still play Beethoven, Mozart, Bach, Wagner, Tchaikovsky, the way that they still play tunes written by or popularized by Charlie Parker, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Ornette Coleman? The list goes on. Charlie Mingus, Charles Mingus, one of the great titans of jazz. We should mention him more than we do. And it's an open-ended question. I think a lot is going to have to do with how well this transition period integrates younger generations with the older generations. Just as great conductors, Arthur Nikisch, passing on his knowledge to Wilhelm Furtwängler, just as John Coltrane passed on his great knowledge to Pharoah Sanders. Will we see a passing of the knowledge, of the vibe, of the spirit from the rock stars of the 60s, 70s, and 80s to the rock stars of a forthcoming generation? It remains to be seen. And even though this King Crimson style tour isn't quite, it is quite cross generational, but not immensely. But seeing how it's perceived and seeing if it can remain true to the music rather than being a commercial venture, I think that things could look very interesting. It's all about integrating the young generations, and that doesn't mean that a group of artists playing King Crimson music 20 years from now will ever be as popular as the real King Crimson. Just as sure as if John Coltrane was still alive, he could sell out a theater probably a lot quicker than someone, however good, playing the music of John Coltrane. But all of that remains to be seen. It's nice, though, that one of the more neglected periods of the King Crimson canon is coming to a town near you. And I also love it that the place they chose to do, instead of a traditional press conference where they did their thing announcing it to the world, they did it on Rick Beato's YouTube channel. Talk about keeping it modern and keeping it real. Well, like, subscribe, all of that nonsense, and we'll see you next time.